Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about what's been so consistent and impressive about the Timberwolves through the first 6 games of the regular season. There's a couple of key things that they continue to do extremely well. We'll also talk about a couple of areas that they're performing well overall in spite of a couple of these other areas in which they're struggling. We'll also preview the Wolves-Pelicans game on Wednesday night at Target Center. Keys to that one. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day. And happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves close out a 4-game homestand with the game against the New Orleans Pelicans on Wednesday night. We'll preview that one later in the show. But I want to start by talking through the most consistent things about the Wolves through 6 games this season, the first 2 weeks of the regular season. And then also, they've performed so well in spite of a couple of key problems to keep an eye on here moving forward. We'll do all that here on the show today. First of all, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Also a reminder that on the SXM app, you can listen to the fantastic Alan Horton call play-by-play of the Wolves game tonight on Sirius XM. Again, that's the XM app on Sirius XM. All right. Let's start by talking about all of the things that the Wolves have done well this year and what's been most consistent across their 4-2 start, which of course includes these last, 3 consecutive impressive wins. The one on Saturday, notwithstanding, it was still an impressive win, but the win over Denver last Wednesday and then Boston on Monday, 2 previously unbeaten teams, are so impressive. And across the majority of the first 6 games, the Wolves have done a handful of things extremely well. I should note off the top, it was announced late on Tuesday that Jordan McLaughlin will be out 4 weeks with an MCL sprain. It was the end of the third quarter when it looked like Naz Reid kind of fell back into McLaughlin's leg, obviously inadvertently. McLaughlin kind of tripped and then fell, was fouled, and knocked on a couple of free throws after the incident happened. But it sounds like he'll be out 4 weeks. Of course, the Wolves, that could mean more Shake Milton. It could mean more Nickeil Alexander-Walker. It could mean some Dacian Nix, who, of course, is on a 2-way contract. All of those, outcomes are possible following the Jordan McLaughlin injury. It's too bad. I mean, we're not quite a couple of weeks from about when McLaughlin got hurt last year with the calf injury that basically tanked the rest of his season. He came back, of course, but was never really himself. So hopefully this isn't something that lingers beyond those 4 weeks for him and he's able to get back on the floor. Because when he has been in the rotation, and he hasn't been every night, but over the first 6 games, he's played well so far this season. All right. Some of the consistent themes for the Wolves so far this season that are so impressive. Let's start with the most obvious one, and that is the defense. The Timberwolves defense has been so incredibly impressive. They're number 1 in defensive rating, and this is despite playing the toughest schedule in the entire league so far, based on any strength of schedule metric you're going to find. They're first in opponent points per game, which is obviously a different way to measure. Defensive rating is a better efficiency metric, but points per game, to be first in both categories, is really impressive. And the Wolves are leaning on that half-court defense, especially to propel them right now, in spite of some of the offensive issues, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But Rudy Gobert has been phenomenal. I don't love individual player defensive and offensive ratings. I think they can be a little bit misleading, quite noisy. But Rudy Gobert has been phenomenal. The Wolves have been doing more of playing Karl-Anthony Towns in the pick and roll at the level and allowing Rudy to basically play free safety and roam the back line, swat shots, impact opponent forays to the rim, deter opponents from even attempting to score at the rim. And the strategy has been altered a little bit depending on the opponent, but that's by and large been what seems to be Chris Finch's preferred method of defending right now. Is like, hey, if Mike Conley can get through ball screens and Karl-Anthony Towns can play up at the level, you let Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards worry about the wings, deflect passes, use their length, just be disruptive in general. And then you can have both McDaniels and Anthony Edwards kind of helping, essentially collapse down low to assist Rudy Gobert at the rim. And you've got yourself a pretty good recipe for success. Plus, when McDaniels and Anthony Edwards do that, they're also in much better position to rebound. Both those guys, their first 3 years in the league for each of them were really disappointing rebounding the basketball. Last year, Anthony Edwards was much better, but McDaniels has always had a disappointing mark in terms of rebound percentage. It's also not where it needs to be this year. It's only 6.9%, but Ant is back up over 10% once again. So the way the Wolves are playing defense should also help them in that category. So again, number one in defensive rating, they're still number 4 in defensive rebound rate. They were 1 for a little while, but 78.7% is not shabby at all. And the other thing the Wolves are doing really well, we'll talk more about staying out of foul trouble later when we get to keys of the game against the Pelicans. But the Timberwolves last year fouled a ton, the last couple of years even. Remember, 2 years ago, they were a middle-of-the-pack defense. Let's look at that real quick. They were 13th in defensive rating 2 years ago. This is pre-Rudy Gobert. But they were dead last in free throw attempts per field goal attempts defensively, meaning they gave up a ton of opponent free throw attempts. Last season, the Wolves were number 10 in defensive rating at the end of the season. They were still 26th in free throw attempts per field goal attempts. And that number was a .225. This season, again, we know only 6 games. Still, it's a .151. That's nearly 3/4 of a free throw less per field goal attempt that an opponent is attempting. That's a significant difference. And that is 4th best in the league. So the improvement in terms of defensive rebounding, the improvement in terms of defending without fouling, at least to the point of not allowing opponents to shoot a ton of free throws, that has helped drive down opponent offense considerably. The other thing is they're number 1 in effective field goal percentage defensively. And that I think certainly good defense impacts that. I'm not at all suggesting that's simply a luck statistic, but I think there's just a little bit more luck baked in there than there is with defensive rebounding and defensive free throw rate, right? There's just a little bit more luck baked into effective field goal percentage. Absolutely, you can drive that down by playing solid defense, by forcing the opponent to shoot shots that you want them to shoot, not that they want to shoot. That's kind of the whole point, right? Defensively. So it's not necessarily the number 1 effective field goal percentage. It's the number 4 defensive rebound rate, the number 4 free throw attempt per field goal attempt rate, and also just in general, just being so solid in the half court. The transition defense has been spotty. There's been moments where, it just hasn't been where it needs to be. And that, of course, was a massive problem last year. But the half court defense has been awesome. I want to make one other point about where the Wolves sit right now league wide, given their offensive, I said a minute ago, spotty offensive performance so far, but also the league's best defense. I want to give a little bit more color to where they sit league wide. And then I want to talk about those issues that the Wolves are still having, players that need to play better. We'll close the show here today by getting into keys of the game against the Pelicans on Wednesday night. We'll do all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. With the basketball season here now, you can pick a combo of projections across football and basketball from the Specials League, a league that's created specifically for combo projections that include 2 or more players for different sports leagues. For example, you could pick LeBron James and Travis Kelce at a 10.5 combo of 3-pointers made plus receptions. So you get your cross sport and you get your multiple different categories. You can also play along some of PrizePicks' favorite players, like the rapper Meek Mill, comedian Andrew Schultz, and more. You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the PrizePicks community each and every week. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every day or tomorrow on the show, it will be the post-game podcast. We'll talk all things Wolves-Pelicans. That'll post early Thursday morning. Late Wednesday, following the game, you can catch the live postcast with our friend Luke Inman hosting, and he'll be along with one of the guys from Canasupis, either Jack Borman or Tyler Metcalf. It's live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, and then we'll have the audio for you here on the Locked On Wolves feed. So if you don't listen to a show again until mid-morning Thursday or whatever, you're going to have 2 Locked On Wolves episodes after this one in your feed. You'll have that live postcast with those guys, and then you'll also have this show hosted by me that will publish early Thursday. So go check that out on Thursday after Wolves-Pelicans. We'll have you covered from each and every angle here at Locked On Wolves. All right. So big picture, and by big picture, I mean the first 2 weeks of the NBA season, big picture, right? The Timberwolves are 4-2. They've played, 2 or 3 games less than some teams. So like I get it. They've played 6 games, but I think context is still very important. And the Wolves' 3-game winning streak now has them in 4th place in the Western Conference behind the Warriors, who have played 2 more games and won both of them, but 4th in the West. The most important thing for me at this point, if we're just looking at the standings, is that the Timberwolves have the 4th best point differential of any team in the entire NBA. That's led by Boston at a plus 14.5. Remember, they were 5-0 until they played the Wolves the other day. And then the Sixers at a plus 13.2. They're 5-1. And then the Denver Nuggets, who the Wolves just beat, at a plus 10.9. And then it's your Minnesota Timberwolves with the 4th best point differential in the league so far at a plus 8.8. By the way, the Celtics and Nuggets combined are 12-2, and their only 2 losses are at the hands of the Minnesota Timberwolves at Target Center in the last 6 days. It's impressive. It's impressive. It's in some ways the MO of this team from last year, which is rising to the challenge and faltering in games that they should win. In that case, or in this year's case, they're 0-2 on the road. They lost in Toronto. They lost in Atlanta. Both games the Wolves should have won. And they could easily be looking at a 5-1 or 6-0 record themselves. We haven't exactly seen that same test yet this year. And also, by the way, when we talk about standing up to good teams last season, the Wolves weren't necessarily beating good teams. They did a little bit. They did some, obviously, over the course of the season. It's just that they were more consistently competitive against good teams than they were against bad teams, which is very strange. But I mean, like, the Jazz aren't going to be a great team this year. They're what, like 2-7 or something, 2-6 right now. The Wolves beat them easily, as they should have. They beat a shorthanded Miami team fairly easily as well, pulling away in the 4th quarter about a week and a half ago. So for the most part, this has been a really impressive start. Now, a couple of things to keep an eye on here. I mentioned the transition defense in the first segment. Obviously, that still needs to improve a little bit. I think it's so much tied to effort and just understanding each other, trusting your teammates, floor balance, etc. All that's related. And I think the Wolves are trending in the right direction there. It's just one of those where, because so much of it is effort, it feels like unforced errors. If the Wolves give up too many easy points, I mean, it is literally unforced errors in that case. But when the half-court defense is so good, if you could just be decent in transition, you're going to have the number 1 defense in the league by far. So a little bit of help still on transition in terms of transition defense. The offensive flow, of course, that's the biggest issue right now. It's just not consistent. Still, sometimes, the ball's too sticky. It gets into hero mode a little bit too much. And as awesome as he was in overtime, scoring like 8 points down the stretch. And by the way, not picking up a 6th and disqualifying foul after picking up his 5th early in the 4th quarter. It was an outstanding, awesome performance. The Wolves won in large part due to Anthony Edwards. But the headline for me was just how good the defense was. because we know Ant can go off. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. This team has a stellar half-court defense, improved rebounding, which is very important, and a high floor on offense. I mean, the Wolves, and by that I mean really Anthony Edwards, can get buckets whenever they need to. But it just isn't consistent enough yet. And this team has such massive overall upside. Even with all those struggles, this team is the number 4 seed in the West right now. They're the 4th best point differential in the entire league. They're the only team to beat the Boston Celtics or the Denver Nuggets, and they've beaten each of them once so far this season. Even with those issues, this team has been extremely impressive. In terms of a couple of individuals that, of course, play into the bigger picture that need to step up, Shake Milton has easily been the most disappointing part of the first 6 games, and you feel bad for the guy because he just, I mean, it's his first season in Minnesota. The first 6 games have not gone to plan. I'm not worried about Shake Milton. He's been a good player for a long time for the Philadelphia 76ers the last, I think, 6 years. But he turned in another, in fact, he didn't play in the second half of the Boston game on Monday. He played those 3 first half minutes, and then Jordan McLaughlin got his minutes in the late third quarter. McLaughlin hurt his knee. The Wolves just played, 8 guys in the fourth quarter. So Shake played only 3 minutes, and that's on the heels of some more disappointing performances. You go back and look, he had 15 minutes against Utah, had 8 points, no assists. The game before, 18 minutes against Denver, 2 points, 1 assist. So he's played 15 to 18 minutes in 4 games. I'm sorry, that doesn't include the opener. In the last 4 games prior to Monday, and only the 3 minutes against the Celtics. My bet is the Wolves give him another shot at basically like, hey, the backup spot is yours. The backup point guard spot behind Mike Conley is yours. McLaughlin's injured. He'll get every opportunity to earn that spot and keep that spot as the primary backup lead guard. I hesitate to say point guard, but lead guard as a talented scoring combo guard and somebody who can obviously distribute as well. He's got to step it up. Nickeil Alexander-Walker has been the other one that's been a little bit disappointing. And of course, what do these guys have in common? Well, they're both big, important bench pieces. Alexander-Walker started a little the first couple games of the season when McDaniels was hurt. But each of those guys are veterans that just need to come to the party, right? They need to be more consistent in general. They need to shoot the basketball better from the perimeter. They need to be appropriately aggressive and active. But that's what the Wolves bench needs that. Otherwise, it's Naz Reid. That's kind of it, right? That's your 8 guys that are going to see consistent minutes. And again, with McLaughlin out, we may just see more Shake Milton. I think it's pretty likely that it also means that we could see Troy Brown Jr. getting back into the rotation. That's a possibility too. So all that we need to keep an eye on. But Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Shake Milton both need to just simply play better, especially with Jordan McLaughlin out. But again, it's a little bit of a nitpick, right? The starting lineup's been so good. Naz Reid has been so good that there's like, in spite of some of these very real issues, the transition defense, the offensive flow that's struggling. I mentioned a couple of times the Wolves are number 1 in defensive rating. Well, guess what? They're number 21 in offensive rating. They finished last year 23rd in offensive rating. Anthony Edwards making difficult shots is kind of sort of keeping them afloat right now, both actually in the win column and also individually, or I guess on the team game by game level. It's this very real, impressive shot making talent that goes back to that high floor conversation I was having on Tuesday on the show. The Wolves have such a high floor from an offensive level. It's got to be about where it is now. And because the defense is so good, and the top level version of Anthony Edwards on both ends of the floor is so good that this team can manage to be 4-2 with a couple of really difficult wins this season. Like I don't think it's crazy to assume is maybe not the right word. Crazy to expect the Timberwolves offense to continue to move up that leaderboard in terms of offensive rating. They should at least be a top 12-ish unit. And frankly, higher than that, given the amount of talent. But it's going to be hard to change all those habits overnight. And I know Chris Finch is working on it, but this team has such an impressive upside from an offensive perspective. And they've apparently they're already there defensively. That's at least what it appears to be at this point in time. All right, I want to close today by previewing the Timberwolves matchup against the Pelicans. That's what we got for you upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get in on the action. There are tons of things you can bet over there. Of course, it's still college football season. We've got college basketball starting this week, NFL on Thursday night. And of course, basketball and hockey, NBA and NHL ongoing too. There's so much stuff that you can bet on over there. The app is extremely easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that include spreads, player props, over-unders. You can look at win totals too. I'm sure that there's in-season adjusted win totals for teams. I was an over on the Wolves, 44.5. Feels like a good bet now. There's even more there, though. So go check it out at FanDuel.com. Again, FanDuel.com/locked on, and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, Timberwolves play host the New Orleans Pelicans on Wednesday night. The Pelicans, to this point, are 4-3. They're currently 5th in the Western Conference. So if you look at their standings, they're not much behind the Timberwolves. They are healthy-ish. CJ McCollum is out with the pneumonia, I believe it was, and collapsed lung. So there's no CJ McCollum. Trey Murphy and Jose Alvarado have been out really since the season started, and Najee Marshall continues to be out too. So it's a little bit of a shorthanded New Orleans Pelicans team, but it's very possibly a team the Wolves could be battling with seeding wise in the Western Conference. So it's exceedingly important that the Timberwolves win this game, right? You want to have that tiebreaker. You want to have that essentially that extra game lead over the team that's chasing you. So this is an important game. I want to talk through a couple of my keys to this one and what I'd like to see the Timberwolves do. Number one, the Timberwolves have to win the battle of the boards on both ends of the floor. And New Orleans isn't necessarily particularly, at least so far this season, they're not a particularly dynamic offensive rebounding team. They're 17th in offensive rebound rate, but the Wolves have always had trouble with Jonas Valanciunas. He's always given the Wolves fits on the glass. And of course, having both Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns per Tim Connolly's plan should deter a lot of that stuff. The Timberwolves should continue being a strong defensive rebounding team. Again, 4th in the league defensive rebound rate wise. The Pelicans are number 17 in terms of offensive rebound rate themselves. So it's important that the Wolves win the battle on the offensive glass. There's no reason, or really the defensive glass when it comes to the Wolves, there's no reason to give the Pelicans any hope that they can, score easy buckets that way. So even if this, all three of these keys are actually just as much about the Wolves as they're about the opponent. But I do think it's important with the Pelicans because, the other thing is they don't turn the ball over very much. And so you have to secure possessions off of misses when you can. So when the Pelicans miss, you got to stop that possession in its tracks. You got to get the ball back and head back the other way because they simply they have a low turnover rate. They are number 6 in the league right now offensively in terms of offensive turnover rate, 11.7%. So rebounding the basketball well after forcing them into hopefully a difficult shot is going to do a lot for this, towards the Wolves winning this particular game. Second key that you can see on there if you're watching on YouTube is to move the ball on offense. And again, this is another one that's really all about the Wolves themselves and not as much about the opponent. New Orleans is, fine defensively. They're 21st so far in defensive rating. They don't turn opponents overall that much, 22% turnover rate, middle of the pack in terms of free throw attempts allowed per field goal attempt. The Wolves simply, again, more about them than it is about the Pels. Just keep the ball moving in offense. Avoid the trap of the sticky basketball. Avoid playing too much isolation basketball. And this Pelicans team, they have a couple of nice wins, but they're 4-3. They're a beatable team, especially without CJ McCollum. And the Wolves will be in a really good spot if they simply keep the ball moving on the offensive end of the floor. The third thing is staying out of foul trouble. And I put this on here, again, about the Wolves, not necessarily the Pelicans. As we've established, New Orleans is pretty middle of the pack in terms of drawing free throws and drawing fouls and getting to the free throw line themselves. But the Timberwolves have had kind of this relapse of foul trouble issues, most recently from, Rudy Gobert. No, not Rudy Gobert. It was Jaden McDaniels, then it was Karl-Anthony Towns, and then in this last game it was Anthony Edwards, who had to change the way he was playing towards the end of the game because of the foul trouble. So the Wolves need to be cognizant of that. Some of it's, it comes and it goes, and, all good players eventually find themselves into foul trouble, but it's a newer thing for Anthony Edwards, and it's happened a couple of times this year. So that's something to keep an eye on. And just in general, the Wolves need to do a better job of staying out of individual foul trouble, which then, of course, also you commit a bunch of fouls, you're putting the other team on the free throw line much faster anyway. So, yeah, I mean, my three things are, again, winning the battle of the boards, limiting the Pelicans to one shot each time down the floor. That's related to that. Moving the ball on offense, making the Pelicans' feet move, make them work for anything that they get. And then also to stay out of foul trouble, especially Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and also Karl-Anthony Towns. Staying out of foul trouble is going to be paramount in this game. The other thing is the line over at FanDuel. The Timberwolves are actually 7-point favorites as of recording this podcast. The over-under is at 220.5. Again, that's over at the FanDuel Sportsbook. Wolves by 7 is the spread. So, I mean, that seems a little high to me. I mean, the Pelicans are still, they're not chopped liver, right? They're still a good team. Zion is healthy. He put up a near triple-double in their loss to the Nuggets the other day at 20, 10, and 9. I mean, Brandon Ingram still scored 22. So you've still got Zion. You've still got Brandon Ingram. You've still got Jonas Valanciunas. So I'd be a little bit surprised if we didn't see that, that line tighten just a little bit. But anyway, go check that out at FanDuel and see whether or not that spread moves since I recorded this podcast late on Tuesday night. All right, that's all we have for you today here on the show. Of course, we will have the live postcast on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel with Luke Inman and one of the Canis Hoopus guys. That's immediately following the game, and then the audio will be on this feed on Locked On Locked On Wolves. We'll do the post-game podcast on Thursday morning, so make sure to subscribe to Locked On Wolves wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also watch this podcast on YouTube as well. And also the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can also follow us on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.